Tonight's show is going to be focusing on Palazzi of Florence. Now, it's not called the Palazzi of Florence because I'm not covering every single palazzo. I'm not even sure I know what every single palazzo would be. I'm just focusing on the ones that I have the most familiarity with, and to me, provide the viewer with the most interesting background. And you know, when I first started putting this show together, which was really several months ago, I was just going to talk about the Palazzi, and I was going to talk about how they began and who was the architect and for whom they were built, and a little history of them. But then as I began to do research on the different palazzi, I began to realize that there was a common thread that combined all the different families, the wealthy families of Florence during the 16th and 15th century. And you know, some of the very wealthy bankers and merchants in Florence built these magnificent palaces. And for the most part, they're beautiful palaces, and people still go to visit them. But they talk more about, to me anyway, about the story of the families that lived there. So I began to really try to understand a little bit about what was going on. And as I read, I began to realize that the common thread that all of these palaces of Florence had were that they were all basically connected in some way to the Medicis. Now we know that the Medicis dominated the city of Florence during the 14th century, let me put it this way, the 1300s, the 1400s, the 1500s, and they even extended into the 1600s. And we know that their presence in the city is felt even now to a very, very large extent. But their influence on other families in Italy, and especially in Florence, is monumental. And as I went through each of the palaces, I realized that every family could in some way be traced back to the story of the Medicis in Florence. So that was kind of what I realized would be a very interesting theme, and that is, you know, talking about the Palazzi. And there is one of the famous palaces in Florence. This particular one is the Palazzo Strozzi, which I'll talk about a little more later. But there it is, show number 67 is the Palazzi of Florence's. And we'll talk first about a little historical perspective as to where the concept of palaces first originated. And then we'll talk a little bit about where some of the famous palaces around the world are. And in that respect, I have about 5 or 6 from everywhere in the world. So we'll talk about that a little bit, and then we'll get right into a story of the Palazzi of Florence with special emphasis upon the families that had these palazzi built. So we're going to begin, however, with, for me to remind you, if you're watching the show live, and there are some people who are, tomorrow at the Woodstock Artists Association, a museum, there is an event, a benefit event called Splash, which begins at 5:30 and ends at 8 p.m. And they're going to be serving, as you can see, food, wine. It'll be art, music, and more. And what it is this actually explains it more. This is the other side of the postcard that really outlines exactly what's going to be taking place there. So you can see that at 5:30, the honorees toast and ceremony, recognizing the outstanding creative achievements of artists Manuel Bromberg and Pia Ostre-Alexander. And then from 6 to 8 is there'll be food and wine served, and there will also be something called Little Gems, where about 150 artists contributed a painting, which will be sold to the general public at the maximum price of $100. So a lot of people can have the opportunity of obtaining the art of some of the great, wonderful artists at Wham. And then there will be an auction of some very, very interesting things. The price is $30 at the door to get in, or $27 if you get the tickets in advance. So I will be there, and Laura will be there. I actually volunteered to help out, so I'll be doing some kind of work that they assigned me to. So again, tomorrow at 5:30 at the Woodstock Artists Association. The next two shows coming up next Friday, June 28th, and the Friday after, July 5th, is my show that I've been planning for many, many months, the Jewish Experience in Italy. And, you know, names of shows always concern me because I don't want to give people the feeling that this is the Jewish experience in Italy or the Jewish history. This is really my experience, and for that reason, perhaps a better name for these shows would have been My Jewish Experience in Italy, or A Jewish Experience in Italy. But I decided to call it that, with special emphasis, of course, on two of the venues where we did a number of really, really fascinating interviews with the director and some of the participants in the Jewish community of Florence, and the same thing is true for the community in Venice. I've done a lot of research on this and studied the interviews. Really, I'm not going to do that much talking because the essence of both of these shows center around the interviews, which are really fascinating, and the people are wonderful people, and they have a story to tell, which is very, very interesting. So that will be the shows coming up in the next 2 weeks. That should not have been there, nor should that, but I left it in there accidentally. I'll tell you what it is. I was moving things around, and this is these are the shows that are going to be coming on in about 3 weeks when I start talking about the Venice Biennale. This particular photo is a photo that Laura took of me doing an interview with one of the artists at the Palazzo Bembo. And, you know, basically they asked me, you know, what they should do, and I said, well, I'm just going to take the interview and I'll ask a few questions, but for the most part, stand in close proximity to your work and just talk about them. And that was one of the artists right there that we'll be talking about. I'm wearing my press pass on my left lapel over there, and basically I'm just holding up the camera, you know, and contributing a few questions here and there. This is actually a picture that we took off the internet on the Facebook page of the Palazzo Bembo. What's going on in this picture, unless you've already recognized it, is Yoko Ono with the hat and sunglasses is being interviewed. I think this was actually a press conference, but she's being interviewed by a number of people who are the organizers of the exhibition Personal Structures at the Palazzo Bembo. The lady on the left is Caroline de Young. The lady on the right is Sarah Gold, and two of the other organizers are on the right side, and Yoko, of course, is in the middle. And I thought this was a pretty fascinating picture. Yoko did not want to be there during the actual opening that Laura and I attended a couple of weeks ago, because she's not somebody that is really interested in a lot of hoopla, and she wanted to just come after everything had settled down. So that's what, you know, and her exhibition is something that we'll talk about sometime in the future. Her exhibition was absolutely astounding, and I'm going to leave that for the time when that actually takes place. This is actually what it was called, Arising a Call, and it has to do with women of all ages, as you could read, from all countries in the world, who were invited to send a testament of harm done to them by men, just simply because they were women. And her exhibition is very extraordinary and very moving. After I had seen it for the fourth or fifth time, I really could not view the exhibition, her work, without, becoming very emotional. So I had a hard time with it, but it's really an amazing exhibition that she had, and we'll talk about that more as time goes on. Right now, though, I'd like to go back to the show for tonight, which is the Palazzi of Florence, and we start with the origins of palaces, which occurred in ancient Rome. So let's take a look at a very, very familiar venue that I've spoken about many, many times and showed you this picture many, many times. This is the Roman Forum, and the hills that you see there up on the right-hand side is the Palatine Hill. And this was the hill in Rome, one of the 7 hills of Rome, where the emperors lived, and the senators and a lot of the notable politicians in Rome lived at the time. The very prominent arch right there in the front to the left side is the Arch of Septimius Severus, and there are some of the other monuments that we've spoken about. This is a really better view of the Palatine Hill. It is now predominantly in ruins, so if you walk around on Monte Palatino, you see some of the remnants of the palazzi that originated on the Palatine Hill. In fact, the word palace comes from the word Palladium, which comes from, of course, the Palatine Hill. So that kind of evolved into the word palace for us. This is a picture of one of the. This is the Flavian palace, which was kind of built by Vespasian and Titus and Domitian, who were known as the Flavian emperors during the 1st century A.D. And they built this magnificent palazzo, and I'll show you what it would have looked like 2,000 years ago. But first I want to focus on this. It was then modified in the 2nd century and in the 3rd century, partly under the direction of the Emperor Septimius Severus. And this is what it looks like today, which is pretty well preserved considering it's been standing there for almost 2,000 years. We're looking at it from the vantage point of the Circus Maximus. The Circus Maximus does not exist anymore. It used to be, if you ever saw the movie Ben-Hur and you saw the chariot race, you would know what that looked like. But this is a view of the Palatine Hill with the Palace of Domitian. This is what it looked like. Let me make that a little larger so you can get a really good view of it. But this is what that palace that we were just looking at looked like 2,000 years ago. And you could see that it is not simply a palace, but really a complex of extraordinary looking buildings. And there was a spot right in the front here where if the emperor wanted to watch a chariot race, he would kind of have this little pavilion here where that would take place, and he would have really a great view of that. It's sort of hard to see in this picture, but it was sort of right in front here. This little portico which overlooked the Circus Maximus. Okay, so everything kind of began in Rome at that time, and now I thought I would. Okay, this is Nero, and probably Nero had built and lived in the most magnificent palace that Rome has ever seen, and maybe even the world. Although I have a few that I'll be showing you in a moment from around the world, which are pretty extraordinary. Nero decided that he was going to have the biggest palace in all of Italy at the time, and he built what is now known as the Domus Aurea. This is what it looked like at the time. I believe it was the 1st century BC. So this was before Augustus, and this is what it looked like. You see that lake over there on the upper right-hand side. That lake eventually was filled in and became what we now know as the Flavian Amphitheater, which is more well known as the Colosseum. And there was a giant statue of Nero that stood in that spot, and that's where the Flavian Amphitheater gets its name, the Colosseum, from the colossal statue of Nero that once stood right off to the right of that. This is what the Colosseum must have looked like during that time, and there is the statue of Nero over there on the right side, which has since been removed. But that's what, we see pictures of the Colosseum in ruins, but that's what it actually looked like in the 1st and 2nd century AD, and it was quite magnificent, as you could see. Incidentally, you see those spikes up there at the very top? They were used for a tarpaulin, which was thrown over the very top of the Colosseum, which blocked out some of the sun from the spectators. So that was what those were used for at the time. But some of the palaces around the world today are quite magnificent and quite extraordinary, and I picked out a few of them. I picked out probably one of the largest in the world, the Palace of Versailles in France, which is located outside of the city of Paris, which I saw at one time many, many years ago. And this is a better picture of what it looked like, and you can see that it's just absolutely spectacular. One of the reasons probably for the French Revolution, because while the French people were struggling with hunger and poverty, this is where the kings and queens lived. So this was not very popular in those times. But that's what the Palace of Versailles looked like at one time. It probably still looks very similar to that today. This is the interior of the Palace of Versailles, which is amazing. Then, of course, you have Buckingham Palace in England, which, many people have visited. And then I looked at some other palaces around the world just by, using a Google search, and I found this palace in Karachi, I'm not sure how to pronounce that, Pakistan, and that is, very, very beautiful, as you can see. And this is the King's Palace in Thailand, which is very unique, of course. And the further east you go, the more unique the palaces look. But that's a very beautiful one as well. And then you have the Palace of Justice in Romania, which I've never seen. I've never seen any of those except for the Palace of Versailles. And the Mysore Palace in India. I didn't get the Taj Mahal because everybody's so familiar with that. But this is China's Forbidden City Palace, which, as you can see, is very unique and interesting. And those are the palaces that I spotlighted from around the world. And then I decided to focus on some of the palaces outside of Florence, in Italy in general. And I started with the palace that Laura and I recently visited, which is the Palazzo Bembo, which is a palazzo which was owned by the Bembo family and is now turned into a venue for art, as you know. And the top level is a residence, a B&B, where Laura and I actually spent 4 days. So this is a very beautiful palazzo, as there are many palazzi that line the Grand Canal in Venice. And this is one of the most famous. This is the Ca d'Oro. Ca is the abbreviation for Casa, so they simply called it, the House of Gold. And the gold name comes from the gilding that appears on one of the levels throughout that environment. Then, of course, there's the Palazzo Ducale in Urbino, which I've seen. In fact, Laura and I stayed in a hotel directly across from the Palazzo Ducale. And the Palazzo Ducale was the home of Federico di Montefeltro. And Federico was a humanist during the 15th century, but mostly he was a condottiero. And condottiero was a mercenary. You know, when the warring city-states of Italy decided to fight each other for power, they didn't have their own citizens doing the fighting. To some degree they did, but for the most part, they hired mercenary armies. And one of the most famous of those was the armies of Federico di Montefeltro. Do I have a picture of him? I do indeed. There's a picture that I took off the internet. And that's Federico with his son. He was a very learned man, but in his youth, he was the general in charge of a large army that used to go around, fighting battles for the various wealthy leaders of the various city-states. There is a very famous book called The Courtier, which is a book about kind of like the way a gentleman is supposed to act in the court of a wealthy king, and that's a very famous book. And so that's Federico di Montefeltro. This is a very famous palazzo in Viterbo. We did a show on Viterbo, and Rick Hurst explained a lot of that to you, but this is the Palazzo Papali. I don't know if that's pronounced Papali or Papali, but Papali definitely sounds better to me. But, this is what it looks like close up. And, it's a beautiful palazzo that the popes used to visit when they left the confines of the Vatican in Rome, with beautiful fountains. Then, of course, there's the Castello Sforzesco, which was the palace that was inhabited by the Sforza family in Milan. And I've spoken about this as well during the show we did on Milan. That's what the Castello looks like from a distance. It is known primarily now for having exhibitions in its courtyard, but also because one of the most famous sculptures of Michelangelo, the Rondinini Pietà, is located in this castle. And there are very few people who know that fact, and you could actually go there and stare at a Michelangelo sculpture without too much competition. And it's a beautiful building, and you could see the sculpture exhibition that was being held at that time, and you can see that sculpture over there on the left side. And then we come to Florence, and I begin with the Palazzo Vecchio. And the Palazzo Vecchio is a Romanesque crenellated palazzo. Crenellated, of course, means that at the very top, along the battlements, are this structure, these indentations here. These are called crenellations, and we'll talk about that a little more in a few minutes. But it was built in 1299, and with the design of one of the most famous architects of that time, who was Arnolfo di Cambio. That name may ring a bell to you because he was the architect of the cathedral in Florence. He was also the architect of the cathedral in Orvieto. This building was also constructed to a large extent by Michelozzo, and it is known as being the seat of government going back to the 14th century. And it had two very, very famous prisoners who were held in that tower. Incidentally, one of the things about this palazzo is that you'll notice the tower is off-center, which is very unusual. The tower is kind of off to the right there, and the reason for that is that the Palazzo Vecchio is actually built on the foundation of two previous palazzi that once existed in that spot. So in Arnolfo di Cambio's attempt to use the existing materials, he built the Palazzo Vecchio on that foundation, and therefore for some reason had to use a tower that was off-center. That tower has two very small cells which were held two very famous prisoners. The first prisoner was Cosimo il Vecchio, who was the second of the Medici bankers, the first being Giovanni de' Medici de' Medici. But Cosimo il Vecchio was the second Medici in the banking family, but fell out of favor among the other wealthy people in Florence at the time. And in 1435, he was housed in one of the cells. The other famous prisoner was the religious fanatic Savonarola, who was held in that same cell in the year 1498, just before he was executed. And this has been the seat of government, not going back to the time it was actually built, as I now read my notes, but going back to the year 1540. Cosimo I, not Cosimo il Vecchio, but a couple of generations later, Cosimo I actually changed the name from the Palazzo Vecchio to the Palazzo della Signoria. The Signoria were the ruling body of Florence, and it was named after them. And here are a few views of it. Here's Arnolfo, who is, one of the most famous architects of his time. And this, of course, is the Palazzo Vecchio, one of the pictures that I've shown many times, with the Loggia dei Lanza over there on the right side. The Uffizi, the most famous gallery of Italian Renaissance art in Italy, probably, peeking out between the Loggia dei Lanza and the Palazzo Vecchio. And there is the Palazzo with the tower slightly off-center. And this is a wonderful panoramic view of what the Piazza della Signoria looks like, with the Palazzo there and all the other well-known buildings. This is one of my favorite. I took some of my favorite shots of the Palazzo Vecchio, and this is certainly one of them. This is another one of them. This is how the Piazza della Signoria looked in the 15th century. And this is, of course, very interesting. This is a drawing. And the statue of David that you see right over here was, of course, the original, which was then moved away in the, I forgot, I think in the, yes, it was moved away in the late 1800s to make way for the copy, and the original was then placed in a museum away from the elements. This is a great shot. This is a drawing that was made, a painting that was made, which shows the execution of Savonarola. So he was taken from his cell in the Palazzo Vecchio, walked along that platform, and that's at the very end is him being burned at the stake. So this is kind of a gruesome picture, but a very, very well-known shot of what the piazza looked like during that time, the very, very late 15th century. And this is the 19th century view of the Palazzo Vecchio. And of course you could see that the statue of David that Michelangelo sculpted and was placed there in the year 1502 had been moved. So that was the 35-year period when right in front of the Palazzo Vecchio there was no statue of David. And soon afterwards a copy would be placed there, which remains there to this day. This is what the interior courtyard looks like. And I've never been really beyond this point, although I think I once went up to the very top of it because there was a sculpture I wanted to see. But this is where most people go. They go into the courtyard. They also go into this room, which is the Sala dei Cinquecento, which is, Cinquecento is translated into 500. And the number of ministers that were in the Signoria numbered 500. And this is where they met, in this hallway. And in this hallway is one of Michelangelo's famous sculptures, the Apollo. And in this hallway, and again, this is, a place where you could really see a Michelangelo sculpture with not too many people around. In this hallway, though, there was a famous competition that took place to paint the opposite walls. The opposite walls are now painted differently, but during the early part of the 16th century, Leonardo da Vinci was commissioned to do one wall, and Michelangelo was commissioned to do the other wall. And that never came about, unfortunately. Then we have the Bargello, the Palazzo Bargello, which was built in 1255 and at the time was considered the oldest public building in Florence. And you could see that it bears a very, very close resemblance to the Palazzo Vecchio. And this, of course, is the Palazzo Vecchio that we just spoke about. And here is a picture in which I superimpose the two structures side by side. Now, the Bargello came first, and you can see, its crenellations on the top with its tower, and then you can see that the Palazzo Vecchio resembles it to a very large degree. I've heard, in fact, the Bargello sometimes described as being the small version of the Palazzo Vecchio. In effect, the Palazzo Vecchio came after the Bargello was created. The Bargello, of course, is now, and there's, one of my favorite pictures of the Bargello is you walk up right through the Piazza San Firenze. There's the Badia Fiorentina, the church with the tall steeple over there on the left. And you could even see a very, very, very faint hint of the cathedral also in this picture, with the Bargello straight ahead, which now, of course, is a famous sculpture gallery, and there's one of its most famous sculptures, and that is Bacchus by Michelangelo, which he did in the very late 15th century, which set the stage for him to get all those famous commissions, not least of which was his very famous Pietà, which then led to his sculpting David. This is what the interior looks like, the interior courtyard. It's a very foreboding kind of place. It's not, it's not a beautiful palazzo. It's kind of like very forbidding, and they did all their executions, in the courtyard. So that's what it, comes into history infamously as. And here's the Palazzo Medici and Riccardi. It's actually was built with the name Palazzo Medici in honor of the Medici family, and in later years was bought by the Riccardi family. But this palazzo was commissioned by Cosimo il Vecchio, which was, as I indicated, the second of the Medici bankers, and it was commissioned and built between the years 1445 and 1460. And it's known for its rustication. And to explain what rustication is, I need to point to this. You see the two upper floors, they use bricks that are very smooth, and yet the bottom floor has bricks that are very kind of rough. That's called rustication. And the purpose was is to give, and they were usually done, the rusticated elements of a palazzo usually were presented on the very bottom floor. And it gave this feeling of great majesty and nobility and strength to the palazzo in general. And I once read that these windows over here on the bottom were actually places where people could come right up there and use their banking facilities. But this is a very well-known palazzo that Medici's lived in for many centuries. This is Cosimo il Vecchio, who promoted the Florentine banking interests during the 15th century. This is Michelozzo, who was the architect of the Palazzo Medici. And there's another view of it, actually the same view. And one of the most famous parts of this that tourists are allowed to view is something called the Medici Chapel. And the Medici Chapel was built, and we'll come back to that in a moment, but this is the painter of that, Benozzo Gozzoli, who painted the Procession of the Magi. And this looks like a very beautiful Renaissance painting, and it is indeed a very beautiful painting. But in this painting are portrayed many of the very famous Medicis from different generations that appear in this painting. It was originally thought that the fellow on horse right in front there was Lorenzo de' Medici, but they proved that was indeed not. But several of the other Medicis follow in the procession. And this is the only part of the Palazzo Medici I've actually seen. And that's Benozzo Gozzoli. And you know, I'm very, very fond of any paintings in which the Medicis are shown. And this is another famous painting that was done by my favorite painter, Ghirlandaio. And there is, off to the right side, the self-portrait, or the portrait I should say, of Lorenzo de' Medici. This is Lorenzo right here, the second adult in line. This is Sassetti, who had commissioned the Sassetti Chapel, for which the chapel in the Church of Santa Trinita gets its name. This is another painting that was done by Botticelli, which appears in the Uffizi Gallery, and also has several members of the Medici family, namely, and I know a few of these, this is Cosimo il Vecchio right here, this is his son Piero, and this is Lorenzo de' Medici over there on the left side. But the one that I always focus on is this portrait right here, self-portrait of Botticelli himself. So that's one of my favorites in the Uffizi. And now we talk about the Palazzo Pitti, which we actually spoke about earlier in one of the shows we did about a month ago, or a couple of months ago. The Palazzo Pitti was designed by Luca Pitti, and there he is there. Remember that really poor picture I have of him that I got off the internet, the best picture I could possibly find. But that's when he lived, and his fortunes were pretty much teamed up with the Medicis. He was a Medici banker, and in 1464, when Cosimo il Vecchio died, Luca Pitti's fortunes kind of went south, and in the year 1549, some future member of the Pitti family sold the Palazzo Pitti to the Medicis. It dominates the city. As you can see, this is a picture that I got off the internet, but was taken probably from the north, in the direction of where our hotel is. I took a picture of this from the Hotel Croce di Malta once, but it didn't come out this good. This is taken from that same direction off to the north, off to the northwest. This is what the palazzo actually looked like during the 15th century. You can see that it was much smaller than it is today. So this is what it looks like now after several additions were put on. This is the original view of it, with the Boboli Gardens behind it and the Fortezza right up there on the upper left-hand corner. And of course, this is now a very famous art museum that has, of course, the Palatine Gallery with some great work by Raphael. One of my favorites is the painting of Julius II. It also has a costume gallery. It has royal apartments. All of these I've shown you a few weeks ago, a few months ago. And of course the very famous Boboli Gardens, which I took you on a tour of. And that's what the Palazzo Pitti looks like from the vantage point of the very top of the Boboli Gardens. There's another view of it actually looking from the palazzo back towards the top of the Boboli Gardens. Then we have the Palazzo Strozzi. And the Palazzo Strozzi is a very, very large palazzo which was built by the architect Maiano for a fellow by the name of Filippo Strozzi in the year 1489. He was a rival of the Medicis and built this magnificent palazzo as a statement, a political statement, to indicate that he was every bit as worthy as the Medici family. In the year 1538, Cosimo I Medici confiscated this from the family of the Strozzis, and it was then returned to them in the year 1568. It's known because it is surrounded on four sides by streets. A lot of the palazzi in Florence are not surrounded on four streets. It is now a museum and was in possession of the Strozzi family, believe it or not, up until the year 1937. But it is now an exhibition hall. This is a bust of Filippo Strozzi. This is what he looked like in the year 1489. And this is what the palazzo looks like. It is absolutely massive. And that's what it looks like as you go down the Via Tornabuoni. And it occupies certainly that corner. And if you go towards the left, you wind up in the palazzo, in the Piazza Repubblica. If you go to the right, straight down, you come to the Arno River. And that's what the courtyard looks like. I've been in the courtyard, and I've also been at some of the exhibitions. These are some of the exhibitions that very famous palazzo now has. It had this very famous one with Picasso, Miro, and Dali. It also had an exhibition known as the Springtime of the Renaissance. So there are very, very famous exhibitions. I've seen at least 3 or 4 of them over the years. And this is a very famous palazzo. This is the Palazzo Pazzi, which is located on the Via Proconsolo. And let me go back to my notes here. The word Pazzi, which is the name of the family, comes from the word pazzo, which means madman. And it was given that name originally because the first soldiers over the walls at the Battle of Jerusalem during the First Crusades, those soldiers that were just with mad abandon just climbed over the walls of Jerusalem were called the Pazzi, and they took their name from that. This was built on a previous palazzo and was rebuilt between the years 1462 and 1472. And it was built for Jacopo Pazzi by Giuliano da Maiano. And it has a traditional design, rustication, and a facade that shows very delicate features. You can see the rustication there on the first level, just like it is in several other palazzi around Florence. And this is a portrait of Jacopo de Pazzi, and that's what the palazzo looks like. The Pazzi family have a history in Florence that is filled with infamy. And this is the reason, if I could tell you the story very quickly, because we're sort of running out of time. But in the year 1478, the Pazzi family, armed with weapons, decided that they were going to assassinate Lorenzo de' Medici and his brother Giuliano de' Medici, who were at the time the de facto rulers of Florence. And they accosted both of them in the cathedral, and with 10,000 people at the mass that was taking place on this particular Sunday, they attempted to assassinate Giuliano and Lorenzo. They succeeded in assassinating Giuliano, but they did not succeed in assassinating Lorenzo, who escaped by virtue of some of his friends who kind of whisked him away very quickly. But from this point on, the Pazzi family had a steady decline and were eventually banished from the city. In fact, many of the Pazzi family and other people who conspired with them to assassinate the Medicis were immediately assassinated. They were not given any kind of a trial, but they were assassinated. One of the things they're known for, one of the good things they're known for, is they commissioned the very famous Pazzi Chapel, which is located just to the right of the Church of Santa Croce. And that chapel was commissioned by the Pazzi family and built by Brunelleschi. He was the architect. And that's another view of the Palazzo Pazzi. That's what the interior looks like. They all had beautiful interior courtyards. And this is a very famous sketch that was done by Leonardo da Vinci, not of one of the Pazzis, but of one of the co-conspirators, a fellow by the name of Baroncelli. who was literally had a noose thrown around his neck and thrown out of the window of the Bargello, and that's the picture of him hanging there. Another grotesque kind of picture, but I'm showing it because it's actually an original Leonardo da Vinci. Okay, and the next palazzo is the Palazzo Rucellai, which was commissioned by Giovanni Rucellai, and the architect was Leon Battista Alberti, who did this design in the year 1446 to 1451. He actually did the design, but the execution of the actual building took place by his protege Rossellini. And it makes use of two things that are very interesting. Number one, pilasters, and number two, entablatures. And let me show you what those are. These are pilasters right here. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. These are actually neoclassical columns that are kind of built into the fabric of the design of the stone, and they're in slight relief, but they're certainly not actual columns, and when they're built in that way, they're called pilasters, and the entablatures refer to the top of the columns. See, the columns have various designs on them. The top of a column is known as an entablature. So the Palazzo Rucellai is known for that. It's on the Via Vigna Nova, which is a really beautiful street. And that's a really close-up view without the writing underneath. And that's a close-up of the pilasters and the entablatures above. And the windows, of course, are very beautiful as well. And now I have to really move. That's the front entrance. And this is one of my favorite palazzos. This is the Palazzo Spini Ferroni. It is the one on the left side over there, that giant building on the left side. And I like it because it is portrayed in a painting by Ghirlandaio. And you know that I'm crazy with Ghirlandaio. And Ghirlandaio does this particular fresco in the Sassetti Chapel, another one of the paintings in the Sassetti Chapel of St. Francis raising a child from the dead. And this is actually, this painting shows an allegory, and there right in the center is the child falling from a window of the Palazzo Spini. These people are the local residents of Florence at that time, including many members of the Sassetti family. But this gives you a very interesting view of what the Palazzo Spini looked like in the 15th century. And this, of course, is Ghirlandaio. This is his self-portrait in that same series of frescoes. This is Sassetti, who is the patron of that particular chapel, and that's his son looking up at him very admiringly. And this is the comparison of the modern view of the Palazzo Spini and Ferroni. Ferroni was the name of the people who bought it after the Spini family gave it up. So that's the palazzo on the modern view of the palazzo on the right side, and the 15th century view of it on the left side. So this is very interesting. And Ghirlandaio is one of my favorite painters of the 15th century, mainly because he gave us a view of what Florence looked like, a very accurate view of what Florence looked like during the 15th century. Oh, and let me just go back to the Palazzo Spini. It was built in 1289, and at the time was one of the biggest palazzi in the city. It was again designed by Arnolfo di Cambio, and in the 1670s was sold to Ferroni. Okay, so what do we have left? We have the Palazzo Pucci, and the Palazzo Pucci, where are my notes? I do not have notes on the Palazzo Pucci. I can't believe it. So I can't tell you anything about this other than that it's one of the large palazzi in Florence. Let me look very quickly. I don't have any notes on that. Okay, so there's a goof right there, but there's one of the famous palazzi, the Palazzo Pucci. And I like this palazzo because it has a very lovely interior courtyard. There you can see some of it as well. I have to kind of move now because we're running out of time. Palazzo Antinori. The Palazzo Antinori is located at the northern end of the Via Tornabuoni, and it was built in the very late 15th century by Maiano, and was built by the Antinori family, which is a very famous wine-producing family. It has a beautiful garden in the middle and beautiful gardens throughout, interior courtyards. These are period furniture. The Palazzo Gherardi, which I have no notes on at all, mainly because I couldn't find anything other than the fact that it was built in the 16th century by a noble Florentine family. The Palazzo Mozzi, which is another famous palazzo that was built between the year 1260 and 1273. A lot of the palazzi were built, as you can see, at that time. It was originally built as a fortress, which overlooked the palazzo, the bridge of alla Grazie. It is now being converted into a contemporary art museum. And this is the Palazzo Davanzati, which was built in the 1300s, and it was built by the Davanzati, eventually sold to the Davanzati family in the year 1578. What I like about this palazzo is that the kitchen, you could see it right up there at the top, and it's very wide open so that, you know, all the cooking and all the fumes could go right out into the atmosphere and wouldn't stifle the people. This is the interior. It's now open as a museum, which is really fascinating. And again, that's period furniture rather than any furniture from the actual one. Okay, and that brings us to the end, finally. And again, I will tell you that next Friday evening, I'm going to begin a series of 2 shows on the Jewish experience in Italy, starting with Florence, and that should be very interesting, and I welcome you to view that. In the meantime, it's been a pleasure bringing the show to you this evening, and I wish you buona notte e buona fortuna.